Good morning. How we doing? More awake than last week. That's good. You know, a week after spring break, you feel so much better. Hey, I'm so glad you're here with us. My name is Seth. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're in the room, joining us online, however you're watching later, listening later, glad you're here. So when I was growing up, when I was a kid, my dad would travel sometimes for work. And when he had a particularly longer trip, like one time he got to go to the Netherlands, and he came back and he brought gifts for us. And we were so excited to get these gifts. We had a little Scottish Terrier named Angus, and when he was in the Netherlands, he saw these ties, you know, back when boys wore ties. You know, I was probably in elementary school at the time, but he saw these ties with Scotty dogs on them, and so he got me and my brothers each a tie, and so that was such a great memory. And so now, as an adult with kids of my own, I kind of enjoy doing the same thing. When I go for a trip, when I'm gone for a longer period of time, I enjoy bringing something for my kids. And my kids, they're so great. They don't even care about the stuff, right? When I get home, they're just like, Daddy, we're so happy to see you. You know, why don't you put your feet up? Let us get you a snack. We would just love to spend some time cuddling with you. You know, we're just glad you're home. Far from reality. They're like, hey, I brought you something. What is it? What is it? Can we have it now? 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 Last time I got home later in the evening, and it was from an international trip. So Carrie knew I was really tired, a little jet lagged, and she's like, let's just let Daddy go to bed. And the kids are like, no way, we will kill you right now. Like, we want whatever it is. And they're so excited about the surprises I bring. And I share that because I think sometimes we kind of treat God the same way. Like our words to God are, what did you bring us, right? Surely you have something for me. Or how about this one? What are you going to do for us? Because you owe me and I deserve this, right? And sometimes we, and maybe I'm just, you know, including myself, I don't want to throw you out there unless it really applies, so you can correct me if you don't agree. But I think sometimes we approach God, we approach church, we approach prayer, and even reading the Bible, and we don't use those things as a means of connecting with God, but we actually use them as a means of getting something from God. And man, I tell you what, if someone figured out that secret formula and could write a book about it, of like how to get from God exactly what we want to get from God, I mean, there would be sales out the wazoo, right? Because everybody would want to read that book. But the problem with that kind of thinking, and my guess is you know this, is that you can't have a real relationship with someone if you're always trying to get something from them. And we know that, which is why we're kind of secretive about it. My guess is you've never said to one of your friends, you know, hey, we're just friends because of something I know you can give me that I need, right? I'm just using you as a friend, but thanks for being my friend, right? I mean, you can't have friendships based on that. You can't have any relationship, a meaningful, authentic relationship based on trying to figure out what somebody else can give to us or what we can get from that person. Now, it's possible I've just described your relationship with your parents, or maybe your relationship, you know, with your spouse, or a marriage you once had, or, you know, a relationship with someone else. But when we have that view of God, and when that's how we interact with God, we actually turn God into a bit of a vending machine, a bit of a gimme, 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 gimme. And when we do that, I think we miss what John, the apostle who wrote the gospel that we're looking at through this series, we miss what John was talking about when he said, look, God so loves us. Do you know what he did? He gave us everything we would ever need. He gave us himself. He gave us his son. And that was actually enough. That when we look at our relationship with God as something we can get from him, and just kind of another fix for the moment, we've actually missed who God is. And when we allow that truth to kind of settle and move, you know, the 6 inches from our head to our hearts, and when we actually allow that to kind of impact us, I think it actually changes everything. It changes everything about how we view everything, and it would overwhelm us. And I think we would begin to experience what the Apostle Paul described as the peace which transcends or surpasses all understanding, that we'll be okay even when things aren't okay, and that we can find purpose in the seemingly randomness of life and the difficult circumstances and the pain and the sorrow and the disappointments that we experience, because we begin to understand who God is. So I say that by way of introduction. We're in this series. We're in part 4 of our series called Bystander. As I said, we are following the Apostle John's account as he interacted with Jesus. And throughout this series, we've been saying that John didn't follow Jesus because of blind faith. We've been saying that John, he followed Jesus because of what he saw and what he heard. And John is the only disciple who actually lived to old age, and so it's believed that he actually was encouraged to write these things down. He probably couldn't actually write, so he probably dictated them to somebody who wrote them down for him. And what he does is he organizes his account around the events of Jesus' life, but he says, look, these weren't just ordinary events. In John's estimation, he would say these are signs. They're not just miracles, they're not simply miracles, but these signs are enough to provide evidence that led people to the identity of Jesus. And what John wanted future generations of people to do, which includes us, right? 2,000 years later, we're those future generations. He wanted people who would one day, scratch their heads and say, who is this Jesus that everybody seems to know about and everybody seems to talk about? His point was that he wanted us to know not simply what Jesus did, which is interesting, but what's more important than knowing what Jesus did is knowing who Jesus is. His identity, God in the flesh who stepped onto the pages of history, who stepped onto the earth, his identity as the Son of God. And it's what Jesus did, these signs that he performed that point us to the identity of who he is. And when we get that, when we understand that, when that begins to settle in and kind of mess us up a little bit and wreck us, it changes everything. In fact, here are John's own words we've been looking at. This is kind of his thesis for the whole reason why he wrote. He put it at the end of his book. He says, these are written, here's why, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have, and that leads us with the question of, have what? That's the question we ask. Have what? What are you going to give us, Jesus? What do we get for this? And that's the tension that John presents for us in the next sign that we're going to look at. This is one of the most well-known, actually, of all the signs. It's the fourth sign. It's the feeding of the 5,000 plus. Now, I grew up in Sunday school in church, and we had these things called flannel graphs, which I'm just telling you, iPads had nothing on the flannel graph. The flannel graph was amazing because you had this wall of flannel, and some retired grandmother probably cut out all these little flannel people. And when your Sunday school teacher would tell you a story like the feeding of the 5,000, they would put it on the wall, and you'd have these little people, and they would move the people, and sometimes if you were lucky, they would call you up there, and you could move the people. And some of you are like, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Others of you, you're smiling because you know exactly, and we're digressing, so we'll move on. But, I think it's because sometimes how this is presented and how we think about it, and maybe even our familiarity with it, that we lose the significance of this sign that Jesus performed in these moments. So where we left things off, we said Jesus is a little bit like a human yo-yo. Throughout the book of John, he starts out in the northern region of Galilee, then he travels south to Jerusalem, back up to Galilee, back down south to Jerusalem, where we were last week. Today, we're back up north in the Galilee region at the Sea of Galilee, which is really more of a lake, and it's going to say lake in the text we're going to look at here in just a minute. But John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, has just been murdered by Herod Antipas. He was beheaded. And John the Baptist drew large crowds. People were kind of enamored with John's teaching. Jesus is drawing bigger crowds. He's creating a bigger stir than John the Baptist. So there's some thought that maybe Herod Antipas's eyes are a little bit on Jesus, and there's a little bit of nervousness about what's going on. So Jesus kind of retreats. He's also perhaps mourning the loss of his cousin who was brutally murdered. And he's finding a place of rest because he and his disciples, they've been busy doing ministry. And so John, he tells us this. And remember, John was there for this. I love what he gives us such a good firsthand account of what was taking place. He says, a great crowd of people followed him, like 100 miles north. They're following him. And why do they follow him? Because they all believed, because they all had blind faith? No. They saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. And they're thinking, where's mine? What's Jesus going to do for me? And so you get this picture of Jesus and his disciples trying to get away from the crowds, but the crowds keep coming. They're following him that 100 miles. Some have seen the signs personally. Others have probably just heard about it, but they're hoping they might have an opportunity to see firsthand or maybe get to experience firsthand. And so Jesus, he sees the crowds in the distance. John says Jesus went up on a mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. And then he gives us a really important clue to what's going to take place here. He says the Jewish Passover festival was near. So this indicates it's springtime, but it also points in the direction of something that the Jewish people at this point in time had been celebrating for 1,400 years. Every year, they would celebrate God using the prophet Moses to lead the people out of slavery from Egypt. Okay, you've probably heard of Moses before in the Ten Commandments. And so the Passover was how God led the Israelites and set them free from the bondage of the Egyptians. So every year, and Israelites, the Jewish people still celebrate this Passover 3,400 years later. This is a big deal. This is a huge celebration. And at the tops of people's minds, every time they celebrate this Passover, is God sending a redeemer. God sending someone to set them free. So in the past, it was Moses, but now they're under the oppression of Rome. And the question is, who's going to set them free from the oppression of Rome? What prophet will God send to deliver his people once again? They're already in the promised land. They just need their oppressors to be crushed. So again, John's there. He's seeing all this. He tells us this, that when Jesus looked up and he saw a great crowd coming toward him, and I just think this is kind of a funny image. You can imagine them sitting on the hillside, and you just see this massive expanse of people, cresting a hill and coming up, and it's like, oh my goodness, here they come. And what do they want? They want a sign. They want a show. They want something to go home and tell others about, because they're enamored with what Jesus is doing. They're enamored with the healings that are taking place. They're enamored with what the signs pointed not to, but what the signs did for them. They lost sight of the signs. They forgot that the signs were meant to point to something. Instead, they were enamored with the signs themselves. So Jesus, he turns to Philip, and he says something kind of humorous. He says this to Philip: "Where shall we buy enough Jesus chicken for all these people to eat?" And Chick-fil-A was born that day. What a great... That's not actually in the Bible, but wouldn't that have been wonderful? No, I mean, we imagine Jesus speaking in King James English, but he didn't, right? Here's what he actually said. He said this to Philip: "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Philip, what do you think? You're from the area. Where would we go to buy bread for all 5,000 of these people? And actually, it was more like 20,000 people, as we're going to see here in just a minute. But how do we feed all them? And, I was thinking about, a town the size of Batesville. What do we got, 8,000, 10,000 people? Our local Kroger doesn't have enough bread to feed our entire town. They got a lot of food, don't get me wrong. No knock on Kroger. But, we live in a culture where we don't even value food. We throw it out all the time. This is a culture where people were, barely on the verge of starvation all the time. Philip, where do you think we could go? Where could we get enough food? It's kind of comical. It was maybe even meant to be a bit of an absurd question. And also, this isn't really what Jesus and his disciples do. If you know much about their story, and we've been going through it over the last couple of weeks, but essentially Jesus would go, he would teach, everybody would be confused, including the disciples. He'd try and explain a little bit to them afterward. They barely got it. Then he would heal some people, and then they would ship out and go somewhere else. They never fed people. This is kind of a new deal. Why are we feeding people, Jesus says? Well, John, Jesus apparently explained this later to John, because he gives us a heads up in the text. He says Jesus asked this only to test Philip, for he had already had in mind what he was going to do. He's not really looking for an answer. He's really just, it's kind of a rhetorical question. He's kind of seeing how Philip's going to respond. So Philip answered him, "It'd take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to even have a bite." Nowhere, Jesus. There is nowhere around here that has enough bread. Not to mention, not only is there nowhere where we can get the bread, we don't have the money for bread. They're living off a shoestring budget. They didn't have a lot of resources, so it was just kind of a ridiculous conversation. So Andrew, who's one of the other disciples, he's Simon Peter's brother, he kind of joins into the fun, and he sees a little boy who probably raced to the front and sat down in the front row, and he goes up to this little boy. He's like, "Hey, you want to meet Jesus? I see you've got a lunch there. Why don't you come up and we'll have a little fun here?" And so he shows the lunch to Jesus, and here's what he said. He says, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" How do we illustrate the absurdity of this whole thing? Jesus is like, "Well, we've got some food now. We've got some 5 little itty-bitty tiny barley loaves, and we've got 2 pickled fishes, which are probably more than a relish. or no more than a relish. And so Jesus, he looks at him, and John tells us this. Jesus said, have the people sit down. Here, there was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Now, why does he say 5,000 men? Because there were actually probably 20,000 or so people is what people estimate. Is it because women and children didn't matter? No. I think it's because 5,000 men was equivalent to one Roman legion. And this is a bit of foreshadowing of what's going to happen. We'll get to that in just a minute. So Jesus sits them all down. He places maybe his hand on the little boy's shoulder. And then John tells us, Jesus then took the loaves and gave thanks. Now, it's hard, again, for us just to imagine the absurdity of this. So to help illustrate it, I brought the Jesus-approved snack for nurseries all over America, goldfish, right? Every nursery in America has goldfish crackers. I love goldfish. But, I mean, it would be the equivalent maybe, and I don't even know if this is enough to represent, but it would be like me holding these up before you all and saying, God has provided such a generous meal for us. I mean, you might get a little fleck of salt off of one of these things. Let me pray and give thanks to God for his generosity to us. I mean, can you imagine just the absurdity of this? But that's exactly what Jesus did. And so he distributed this tiny amount of food. The text continues on. He distributed this tiny amount of food to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish, and you probably know how the account goes. When they had had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left, let nothing be wasted. The people are amazed. There's so much left over. The text says, continuing on, so they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And I think it's almost like Jesus gave a little gift basket to each of the disciples who doubted that this could happen, right? And it's like, here you go, don't forget, here you go. And I don't know when it dawned on the people that this was like unusual, that this was miraculous, right? How did all the food get here, especially the people in the back? And they're like, where were the food trucks? I didn't even see the food trucks pull in, but we're eating, where did all this come from? But John tells us this, that after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, it's like suddenly it dawns on them. There's something significant here. There's something significant here. Now, remember, this is the Passover season, which means Moses is on their mind. And they're thinking about how God had raised up a prophet to set them free from the hands of the Egyptians. And they're thinking about what Moses did. And you may recall when the Israelites were traveling through the desert on their way to the promised land, God provided them miraculously with bread from heaven, manna, which meant, what is it? Because they didn't even know, right? And they wake up, and every morning there's dew on the ground, and it's edible dew, and they can form it into cakes, and they can bake bread. But what happened if they kept that bread overnight? It spoiled. It didn't last. That bread didn't last, but here's Jesus. And what does he have? 12 baskets. I mean, there's an abundance. There's a provision. And the people, they're looking at Jesus, and they're thinking, okay, who is this guy? I mean, we've been wondering, could it be? I mean, could he be? Is this the prophet we've been waiting for? And then suddenly, the text says, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who's come into the world. And in these moments, suddenly their eyes shift, their gaze shifts, and they begin to understand, oh, he's more than just a miracle worker. See, right now they're full, right? Jesus just fed them, so they're full. And I don't know about you. The other day, I came home, I was so ravenously hungry. And Carrie's trying to talk to me, and I'm like, I can't think, I can't focus. I need food. I was hangry, right? And you know what I'm talking about. But when I'm full, I'm ready to listen, I'm ready to see, I'm ready to understand. And it dawns on them, oh my goodness, who is this? And they were prepared to make him a king. But Jesus, he knew the time wasn't right. And again, there's some kind of foreshadowing here with the whole idea of the legion, right? The Roman legion, because Jesus is aware of everything that they're thinking, because they're thinking, okay, we have 5,000 men here. And if we start heading south to Jerusalem, maybe we can pick up another 5,000 before we leave the Galilee region. And then when we're halfway there, we'll get another 5,000. By the time we're ready to storm the gates of Jerusalem, we'll have 4 legions of people ready to take on the Romans. I mean, they're ready to make him king. And Jesus, he knew he was king. I mean, he knew his time was coming, but it would be a different Passover. And he knew he would enter the gates of Jerusalem with his disciples. But it wouldn't be a golden crown on his head. It would be a crown of thorns. It would be a crucifixion. And I kind of wonder if this was maybe even a bit of a temptation for him, because this would be such an easier way to do it. It'd be so much easier to have a whole army of people to fight off the Romans. But he knew that that couldn't happen and that shouldn't happen. You know why? Because their stomachs were full now. But I don't know about you. My appetite has a pesky way of coming back. Good as food is, it ends in hunger. And I always want something else. I always want something more. And that's where the people were. There's another gospel that says Jesus it's like he rushed his disciples into a boat to send them off because he was afraid. They were getting ideas in their minds of, oh my goodness, it's Passover. What's God going to do here? So he sends them off. Text says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, he withdrew again to a mountain by himself to regroup, refocus, to pray. So he'd get in a boat and he'd go across the lake. And when he gets to the other side, the crowds would still be there. And little do they know, I mean, he's about to call them out. He's about to thin them out. He's about to call, C-U-L-L, like thin them out, as he presents what it actually means to be one of his disciples. And actually, I mean, maybe he's ready to call us out and call us out as well. Maybe you can relate a little bit to this, or you've been thinking along the lines of, I gave up on church, or I gave up on faith because I wasn't getting anything out of it. It wasn't feeding me the way I needed it to feed me. And so I began looking elsewhere. And don't get me wrong, it's okay. Sometimes God leads us to go to another place or go to another church, but when it's about what I get, when it's about the warm fuzzy, it's about the quiver in the liver, it's about, a healing, it's about feeling good about something, or, we become consumers. Now, you could argue that Jesus almost created a culture of consumers a little bit, because he's healing them, he's feeding them, right? I mean, he's providing them with stuff. But the point here is that they missed the point. They missed the point of why Jesus was doing these things, because he was pointing them to something far more significant. And Jesus' point, as we're going to see here in just a minute, is like, as long as you're looking for an it, whatever it is, the self-help, the feel-good moment, the warm fuzzy, the healing, the answered prayer, the fix my family, the fix my marriage, whatever it is, as long as we're looking for an it, in those moments, we become kind of like the little children at the door saying, Daddy, 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 what did you bring us? What did you bring us? And quite honestly, I'm not sure. I think we might be a little bit guilty of treating Jesus almost like a drug. It's like the Jesus drug that gives us the fix. It gives us the feel-good thing for the moment. And in doing so, we have lost sight of who he is, because when we don't feel it anymore, when we don't get those vibes, when we don't get the quiver in the liver, we just go somewhere else. And in doing so, we miss the person of Jesus. See, Jesus and his disciples, they go by boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Text tells us when they found him, when the crowds found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? We've been looking all over for you. Where'd you go? Why'd you escape? Why'd you leave us? And I tell you what Jesus says next, I just think it actually kind of has the power to wreck us if we will let it wreck us, right? If we'll allow it to soak over us. He says this, he says, you're looking for me not because you saw the signs and realized what they were pointing to, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Like your consumer appetite led you here. You know why? Because it's the next day and you're hungry again. You missed what the signs pointed to. You thought the sign was the point. The sign was pointing to the point. I am the point. Then he said this. He said, do not work for, do not live your life for, do not give your life to. Don't think only about food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. Now, this is a little bit reminiscent of the woman at the well who keeps going there looking for water, and she goes every day to fill up her jars with water. And he says, look, I have a living water that you're not going to, it won't leave you thirsty every single time. I have something so much better. He says to this crowd of people, you're focused on the temporary food. You want a Messiah who's going to do your bidding, who's going to do whatever you want. In fact, he uses this term, he says, the Son of Man. And he uses the term Son of Man because it was actually a term he made up. Nobody knew what the Son of Man was. Jesus was using a term that he could define for them because they had the wrong idea of what a Messiah was and what a Messiah did. He says, you're looking for the wrong thing. Don't miss what I'm offering you because I'm offering you something that is far greater than Rome. It's far greater than overtaking Caesar. It is so much bigger than that, but all they can think about is lunch. So they ask him this question, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? I mean, what will you do for us? Because we're starting to believe Jesus, but we're just not really sure. We've got a few questions, and you know, what are you going to do for us? Which quite honestly is so many of us sometimes. Jesus, what are you going to do for me? How are you going to answer my prayers? What are you going to give me? And Jesus thinking, what else do you need? And they're like, dance, monkey, dance. Do something for us. And then they said this, well, how about this? Our ancestors, they ate manna in the wilderness. Can you feed us again, Jesus? Because it's the next day, we're hungry. And I wish we had time to go through all that Jesus says because it is so rich. It is so rich. But he reminds them what happened to their ancestors in the wilderness. Do you know what happened to their ancestors in the wilderness? They all died. They all died in the wilderness. They got their food every day. And they died. He says, I'm trying to give you something that is of such greater significance. And all you can think about is lunch. And as soon as the magic show ends, I mean, many of you are going to just choose to unfollow it. You're going to choose to unfollow me because you are just in it for the food. And truth be told, after Jesus speaks these words, many choose to unfollow. And he looks at his disciples. This is one of my favorite things. He says to them, okay, are you going to leave too? Are you going to leave too? And Peter, he looks back at Jesus and he says, where would I go? Where would we go? You've provided us with words of life. There's something here that the bread isn't going to satisfy. You have something that's far greater. So my question for you, it's an uncomfortable question, and it's uncomfortable for me because maybe at different stages of my life I would have answered it in a way that, quite honestly, I don't really like. But the question is, are you just in it for the food? Is it, Daddy, what'd you give me? I'm waiting at the door. Dear Jesus, thank you for this day, because that's how we're supposed to begin every prayer, right? Dear Jesus, thank you for this day, and please give me, and I've got my list of stuff that I need you to do for me, and I need a job, and I need healing, and I need whatever. Are you just looking for a fix? Or have you come to terms with who Jesus is? You know, when we grew up in church, and which is the context of many of us, right? I mean, Jesus' hometown people, they didn't recognize him for who he was because he was just so familiar to them. And I think sometimes when we grow up in that environment of church and faith, it's hard to lose sight of who he actually is. He's a king. I mean, he's a king who came to bring his kingdom, right? And can you just imagine if all the people who call themselves Christians in America for 2 weeks began living the way Jesus lived, loving the way Jesus loved, forgiving the way Jesus forgave, others firsting the way Jesus put others first on such a consistent basis? Can you imagine what it would do to our world? And so the question changes, right? The question isn't, what do I get out of this? I went to church. What's my prize? What's he going to do for me? The question Jesus provoked the crowd to answer is, who do you believe I And for many of them, Jesus was a magic rabbi who performed lots of great signs, and they thought they might get lucky and get a piece of it. A few recognized he was God in the flesh, and he gave them far more than they ever imagined. Man, if you're a Christian, you call yourself a Christian, I hope you're not just here checking a box. I hope you're not here paying penance for something you did or something you watched or someone you slept with. Or you're just coming for a feel-good hour, because if that's you, you are missing the adventure of a lifetime. You are missing what he is inviting you into, his kingdom. As I said earlier, you cannot have a real relationship with someone if you're always trying to get something from them. If you're just trying to get something that makes you a user. Jesus is just your current drug of choice, and when it doesn't work anymore, you will look somewhere else. But Jesus, he taught the crowds to pray, Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. You are so holy, God. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth in my world as it is in heaven. That's the invitation, my friends. That's the whole reason John told us these accounts. And so the question is, are you willing to surrender to the King? When we relegate Jesus to just the Savior in chief who provides us a free ticket to heaven, we have lost sight of who he is. Yes, he has provided us that, but he has provided so much more. And when he's enough for you, that is the point when life begins. That is the bread from heaven. Let me pray for us. Father, it is no small thing that you have called us into, that you have invited us into. There's a group of men and women who understood that a king had stepped onto the planet. And when his kingdom comes, the world changes forever. And maybe because we've grown up in a Western context and Western civilization has been so impacted by what Jesus did. Sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. Sometimes we can't even see it. And yet, God, you have called us and invited us into something so great. Help us not to miss it. Help us not to miss it. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I hope you have a great week. Thanks for being here. Look forward to seeing you next Sunday as we continue Bystander.